All right. The way ahead is another good episode of television.
You have no idea how much it pains us to say that.
Everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
Dr. Kristen.
And you are so very welcome to our cozy little corner of the internet, where today we are talking about Season 5, Episode 5 of The Crown, entitled The Way Ahead. And as we were just discussing offline, Episodes 4 and 5 are really, paired very well together. So a lot of similar themes, especially about what kind of monarch Charles envisions himself as in the early 90s, are going to be woven through this one. But before we get into what happened in The Way Ahead, we want to share that our monarch moment for this episode, which for those of you that don't know, happens over on our Patreon. And you can join us at any level. We have 3 tiers available, but any level gets you our monarch moments. Higher levels get you more things, but our monarch moment for this episode is going to pair really well with our monarch moment for episode 4, in which we had a lengthier discussion examining the theology behind the idea that the sovereign cannot be flesh and blood. And because of that element of the divine in them, they are infallible. They cannot apologize. So we talked a lot about that in our monarch moment for episode 4. Episode 5 monarch moment is going to be delving further into how Charles deals with that concept in this episode, and really looking at the theological differences and the philosophical differences between defender of the faith and defender of faith, which Charles makes that key distinction in his interview with Jonathan Dimbley, particularly, which is a very famous interview that he gave and profile of Prince Charles as he was at the time. So that will be happening over on our Patreon after this. Links are in the downstairs if you want to know anything more about that. All right. The way ahead is another good episode of television.
You have no idea how much it pains us to say that. No, it is though. It's a well-constructed
story.
Like this duo of 4 and 5 inform each other in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
We came to we are of disagreements about how much of the phone call transcript we needed to hear. But that's it. The rest of everything else we agree on. Yeah. And we thought it was a solidly constructed episode.
It was, yeah. So the guts of this episode is framed with the aforementioned telephone phone call, which is a transcript of a phone call from a conversation between Camilla and Charles in 1989. That is recorded by an amateur radio enthusiast who, as he is searching the CB waves, accidentally comes across the telephone line in which this conversation is happening. He recognizes that it is the future heir, HRH Prince Charles, and he hits the record button. He takes it to the Daily Mirror, but they decide not to run it at the time because they don't want to be responsible for ruining a royal marriage, because included within the transcript of the recording is very clearly that Charles and Camilla have a personal and intimate and a sexual relationship that is outside the bounds of both their marriages. So We then flash forward to 3 years later, 1992, which is where the show is taking place. And Charles and Diana meet with Lizzie, and Charles says, we wanted a separation. Very interestingly, they show Diana's face, and she's like waiting for him to confirm it, as if he might decide against it. There are no plans for divorce, but this leads to Prince Philip taking charge and holding a family meeting at Balmoral to talk about rehabbing the image of the family, a task force to save the monarchy, in his words, that they end up calling the Way Ahead Committee, which is a terrible name. And it's during this meeting that Charles starts to push back against, push for more radical change. And his ongoing obsession with the monarchy needing to reflect modern Britain and where it's going. And we saw hints of that in seasons 3 and 4 from Josh O'Connor's Prince Charles as well. This is not a new thing that Charles is believing, but it is kind of a new thing for him to stand up to his mother and father in the midst of all of those advisors and to really push back. And the Queen doesn't really hate his spunk or possibly his ideas. And so maybe things are turning around for Charles. Who knows? Dun, dun, dun. The tape is released. And the rest of the episode is the fallout from the tape, Charles's reactions to it, the family's reactions to it, the nation's reaction to it, and how this undermines his attempt to show himself in a better light, to show, who he is as a person. And so he goes on to do this interview with Jonathan Dimbley and like a profile to show more about who he is and to show him in his words, a modern and mature light. And he ends up talking about his infidelity and the phone conversation even in the interview. We end with getting Diana's response to that interview, which is very famously her appearance at a charity event in what is termed the revenge dress. And then, foreshadowing our monarch moment, John Major shows up to meet with Lizzie to talk about the fallout of the interview, and to say that the reaction was very divided, but the claim of being the defender of faith instead of the faith was the most popular part of the interview. So again, we're getting all these hints this season of what kind of monarch Charles wants to be. And I will restate what I said in our monarch moment from last week, that I'm fascinated to know how much of this was written before QE2 died, or how much of it was changed to kind of reflect the fact that he, as of May 2023, will officially be the monarch. So a larger part of this episode too, which we can talk about, was highlighting the work that he has done throughout his career with the establishment of the Prince's Trust, which was specifically established to help underprivileged and under-resourced and oppressed communities. Didn't have that language at the time, but that's what it was for. And it shows some of that work and his ability to understand and appreciate and want to recognize the multicultural nature of 1990s Britain. So it's an interesting episode arc for Charles. It's probably one of the more fascinating ones for him, because he starts out the episode whinging at a dinner party about how he's nothing but an ornament. And by the end, he has found this level of gravitas and maturity that his relationship with Camilla and this whole Camillagate situation. I love that it was called Camillagate and not Charlesgate, but cool. That this whole situation forces him to realize he kind of has to make his own way, and creates this demarcation, this separation between himself and the firm. So, fascinating episode, fascinating themes. Kristen, what would you like to talk about?
So I'm going to throw you a curveball.
Hit me.
I want to talk about how much I hate the term revenge dress.
Oh, yes. I hadn't even thought of it, but yes, it's a terrible name, and so yet so apt for the time.
Oh, Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of talk about the revenge dress and how they would, if in terms of this show, like how would they show it, how would they design it.
Yeah.
I thought it was not a particularly well executed imitation. Like the skirt was a little bit baggier than it really was.
Well, and I think like in part, and I was watching the end of the episode with my mom, who was like, she was like, this girl is too thin for Diana. And I was like, well, she was bulimic. And Mom was like, she didn't look that thin. And then I literally looked it up, and there's a discernible difference between what Diana looked like in that dress and what Elizabeth Debicki looks like. Not to make any statements about the actress herself and her physical health, but just to say it's a very, very different body appearance. So I think for me, it looks
but I could like hem the like the skirt wasn't ruched that much. Like if you're gonna like, that doesn't hit me as a hard dress to imitate. So I was a little bit.
So I don't know if they were trying to lean into the princess's struggles with her eating disorder. That feels insincere and rude, but who knows? They do insincerity and rude things all the time. So I don't know how much of that was fiction or just the actress's body. But there are ways they could have adjusted that to make it more believable. And I agree with you. It just looked like a poor imitation.
But the reason I hate the phrase is because, I mean, this is what we did in the 90s. We do it now to a lesser extent than we did in the 90s. But all women were valuable for was how hot they looked. And in the early 90s, this is the rise of, like, cocaine chic, we call it now. And, like, the ultra thin, and the deal was she's now separated. She doesn't have to dress like their princess. Like, there's a lot of that. If you look at the differences between how Meghan Markle and Catherine dress, like there's differences there too. But to me, that this is one of the fascinations, that this is one of the dresses that one of the main plot points of Diana's life continues. To me, it's like, oh, Camilla is old and frumpy. Mm-hmm. Diana is young and sexy. Mm-hmm. It doesn't do any favors to either woman. Charles has loved Camilla, I think, since he drew breath. Like, regardless of how I feel about infidelity or anything else, they should have never married anybody else but each other.
Yeah.
Ever. Like, ever. But it reduces both Camilla and Diana to their bodies to call that the revenge dress. Yeah. And as though Charles gives a flying shit about what Diana looks like. Because obviously by that point he doesn't. Yeah. Because if he was just in it for what she looked like, their sex life would have probably been a lot different than the way she reported it in the Andrew Morton book. Yeah. So it drove me a little bit crazy. I will say that, like, it's become such an archetype, if you guys don't know that. Like, Taylor Swift has shown up in dresses that look a lot like that at different times. Other women have copied that dress. Mm-hmm. And I respect that, like, you always want to look good after a breakup. And I certainly feel that sometimes too. But I think it was just endemic, again, of how we talked about Diana versus how we talked about Camilla. Yeah.
And we reduced her to, like, the only part of her that mattered was the part of her that was in a relationship with Charles.
Yeah. And I think the older I get, too, the more empathy I have for Camilla. And the more empathy I have for Charles in general, too. Like, in terms, like, of his... They all got screwed by the human rights violation that is the firm. Yeah. Whether they behaved appropriately in it or not, their starting place is a lot different than I thought it was when I was 11 watching this on the news.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, it pairs with the comment that I made about the scandal over the leaked phone call being called Camillagate.
Yeah. Yes, correct. It tracks exactly along with that. Yep.
It is indicative of the way we talked about women at the time and the way we talked about relationships, and still do to a large extent in a lot of areas.
This just tricked for me, though, because I am learning that I have a more obsessive relationship with this story than you do. There was a Diana scandal at the time where a phone call between her and one of her male friends was leaked. And it was called by that gentleman's name.
Interesting.
and not so
Diana-gate. Yeah.
it was not called. So I want to put I think it was yes, sexism, yes, but I also want to offer up that it's possible that their pattern also was the person outside of the whales, the War of the Whaleses.
Interesting. The War of the Whaleses. That was very clever.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, but I want to point that out too. That something that the show did not cover is that 1992 also had some leaked tapes from Diana.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me, I think, to see how the show kind of, it's like a tennis match between in
Who
the
they
show.
like more?
Yeah, like who they blame more, who they like more, and so like, sometimes Charles is the baddie and sometimes Charles is a sympathetic character. I don't think they're ever out to try and make Diana the baddie as they have been explicitly about Charles, but they do.
Although I saw a headline that said Elizabeth Debicki defends people from calling Diana manipulative. Ooh. So I'll say too,
maybe in later episodes. I have not watched anything more than episode 5, so I don't know.
Yeah. This phone thing was such a big deal that John Major had to stand in front of Parliament, and he had to commission MI5 and MI6 to double check that the palace phones were not tapped.
Yeah.
So, like, this is, I don't know if they're going to cover anymore, but this was, like, a thing.
Yeah.
The idea of national security, like, yes, we had to hear that he wanted to be, like, in her underwear. Sure. But, like, the bigger thing is how can somebody in an RV in a field listen in to a supposedly secure phone line?
Right. Yeah. So I don't think they're going to cover it because I think they'll go to something else. But it was, a major, not just like drama scandal for the royal family, but major concerns for national security and the invasion of privacy, in which it has been a long thread within the royal family, probably going back to that time period of leaked phone calls. And then you get into a lot of the stuff that happened with paparazzi and with the British press for William and Catherine's courtship, and anytime there's a scandal, and that was it Piers Morgan like tapes or something, like there's been all sorts of like invasions of
everything
privacy.
On the News of the World.
Yeah.
If you don't know what we're talking about, Google Hugh Grant and News of the World.
Yes.
And you'll learn everything you need to know.
Yeah, so there's some larger themes of things that were happening in the larger British populace at the time as well that these were indicative of. But yeah, it was a massive invasion of privacy, and I think they did highlight how that felt for Charles and the royal family. And like, I loved Anne's conversation with him where she goes to like bring him cold medicine that will actually work, which was hilarious.
Yeah.
She's like, well, I brought you horribly vile chemical stuff that will actually help. But she says,
it was a little too gynecological for my taste is the best line.
You and me both. That was hilarious. Yeah, it was so good. I can't imagine hearing that tape about my brother. Well, I would have said I would have said something similar. But yeah, to where she said to him, like, you often create your own messes, but like this is too far. This has crossed the line.
Mess.
This is like, I'm so sorry that this has happened to you. So I appreciate that the show made a clear distinction in, what the version of Charles that we see in the show has struggled to accept responsibility for his actions many, many times. Lots of reasons. We've covered this. Why that could possibly be the story the show wants to tell about him. But yeah, this was something different. This was a breach. This was a bridge too far. And I love, like, the juxtaposition between Lizzie and Charles in this episode, and especially I'm just looking at my notes here, when Major comes to talk to her and tell her that, like, the defender of faith was the more popular thing. And she said, Charles has often not liked a lot of the parts of this job that mean you are an inanimate object. And she says he prefers to be animate, which is what he has said like throughout this whole episode and seasons. And then she says one can end up undoing more than doing, which is, you know, the counterpunch to like all the good stuff that he's done with the Prince's Trust, all of this modernizing he is attempting to do, and then the undoing in her mind of this tape being leaked and the questions of him again being able to handle being the monarch, which was the conversation throughout the whole 90s. Like, nobody knew Lizzie was going to live to be 96. I mean, the Queen Mother lived to be a flippin' long time, so we could have guessed. But you never know. And so he is always, like, as he said, I think in episode 4, like, in this waiting... Oh, no, in the beginning of this episode, stuck in a waiting room.
Yeah.
And, like, imagine being stuck in a waiting room for, like, 50 years. Like, your whole life. What is he now? Like, 75, and he's now king of it.
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy. And so, like, always being prepared but never being important enough. I can see a lot of that in the way that these actors continuously portray Charles. But yeah, for me, that was the dichotomy that was fascinating in this episode. And also, I think, as you were talking, the thing that I wanted to bring up too was what we learned about Charles and Camilla. I mean, I think we already knew it, but it was reiterated in this episode that they clearly love each other very much. In, like, it reminded me a lot of Margaret and Peter Townsend in their relationship. And then parts of Anne and her relationship with this new guy, Tim, of, like, what it looks like when people are actually in love and in a partnership.
Yeah.
And, like, Camilla is the person who knows him the best, the person he trusts the most, and has been since they were 20.
Yeah.
Like... and I loved that Anne said that as well. She was like, it was really nice to see that you're just like a teenager in love. And it makes it all the more tragic that they all, you know, they're kids, obviously, but that the 4 adults in these 2 relationships were forced into this untenable position for so long.
Yeah. I think... You know, what I really took away from the phone call was how that is how couples talk. Like, that is how, and not just romantic couples. Like, obviously, like, I don't, you know, make sex jokes with my best friend, but, like, that's the way that people who know each other to their core talk to each other. Mm-hmm. With sexual overtones or not, you know, that kind of easy back and forth between public policy and flirting. Like, the number of times, like, it's just...
Yeah.
I don't know, I sat here and I was like, this is how people talk. Mm-hmm. And he never talked like that with Diana. Diana never talked like that with him. Maybe we'll find out she talked like that with Dodie. I hope she did. I hope that girl had that before she died.
Same.
And it sounds like that's what Harry and Meghan are like. It does not sound that's what William and Catherine are like. So, who knows? Who knows? But I think I was actually gratified to hear that much of the narrative that we got. Also from the timing, because it then let us see and spend a couple seconds as the voiceovers were going with every person this affected. And I thought that was outside of the children, which is totally fine. Because I also just can't imagine being like, I mean, William was what, like 9 at that point when he would have to learn that his dad said that about, you know, like.
Yeah.
Okay. Like that's
11.
a pass. 11.
Was he born in 81, I think? Yeah, so he would have been 11.
81. Yeah, so he would know what a tampon is. Like, that's delightful for him.
So hard.
So hard. So, like, all of that sucks. Like, it sucks because it's not anyone's business but theirs. And the details of the conversation probably aren't even their spouse's business for the simple fact that it wouldn't do anything but hurt them. You know? So, like, knowing the presence of the conversation was enough for Andrew and Diana to then have to suffer through it with the rest of the country making a mockery of it.
Yeah.
It's been a joke for 30 years.
Yeah.
And you listen to that, that's not a joke.
No, those people love each other.
Like, and their love destroyed other people's lives because of the circumstances that they were all forced into that they did not consent to.
Yeah, and the system that, again...
I mean, like, I know they consented, but they didn't. We all know.
We all know. You know, in a system that does not allow them to be human beings.
No.
And actually, like, actively tries to, like, break anything in them that would make them human. And so, you know, I think this story, the way they told it, is a great example of how complicated humans are and how nothing is black and white.
Not a single thing. And
especially not relationships. Any relationships, never mind relationships that are quasi-consensually forced to be in this weird system in the public eye all the time. And, you know, we get hints of the level of the British press in this episode, but not anywhere near as invasive and destructive as they become.
No, as they already were at that point. Since you bring that up, I would say that that's a criticism I would have of this entire season, is that there was like stalking allegations. Already there were problems. That there's no discussion of the fodder that this provided. Like the sucking on the toes thing, like that was an invasion of privacy photo. From that Sarah, the then Duchess of York, got photographed. It's referenced in episode 4. That was a paparazzi photo. So, like, they are not discussing that side. And because of what it will become in Diana's life, I actually think that's slightly irresponsible.
Yeah, and you know, if you haven't lived in the UK, you don't understand how different it is from American press and American paparazzi.
It's insane.
Like, you do not understand. And, you know, that's one of the things, if you are interested and pay attention to the contemporary royal family, was one of the things that Meghan Markle has said. Like, as a professional actress, high-profile actress, she was on Suits for like 10 years or whatever, she said she had no idea the extent to what it was until she lived in it. And so I think this is an opportunity for the show to really kind of delve into that, and they haven't taken that opportunity. And, you know, like, they gave us one scene in this episode where they were hounding Camilla at her house as she was being forced to move out. But I agree with you, it is irresponsible. Because a lot of people watching the show, you know, as much as we are saying that so much of this is in living memory, there's a lot of people younger than you and I probably watching this show that don't remember Diana's death or weren't alive for it.
Or still believe it was an accident of some fashion,
Yeah.
and not that she was pursued to her death and an accident was forced.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope that they do better for the final 5 episodes of this season in establishing that, so that when they cover her death, it's an opportunity to kind of expose the horrendous, insidious invasion that is the British paparazzi and the British press, in a way that many people who don't, like, you know, live in the UK and see the newsstands every day could possibly understand.
Yeah, I mean, just rent Notting Hill. Like, that's actually pretty accurate.
It is pretty accurate. It is pretty accurate. Oh, bless, I love that show. Yeah, but I think that's a fair criticism for this episode and for this season so far. In what otherwise is a well-crafted 45 minutes of drama.
Yeah. I think it's
shocking both of us.
Shocking both of us. I think it struck me because they really showed the Daily Mirror as having some sort of ethic.
I know.
Which, like, when they chose to shelve that interview, that may be the only ethic they've ever had. I mean, like, it, yeah.
And it wasn't...
Anyway. Anyway.
And, like, they made it seem like they didn't want to be responsible for ending a royal marriage. They didn't want to be blamed for ending a royal marriage.
Yeah, they didn't want to get sued.
They didn't want the bad press. It's not that they
Yeah.
give a damn about that marriage.
No.
They just didn't want the negative ramifications of releasing the story, and that was not made clear either.
No. So, yeah, the Daily Mirror
Miss me.
The Daily Mirror should never come out looking like roses as a publication.
Absolutely
Ever.
not.
Ever.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
So yeah, the only other thing that I will say is that I would just like to touch on briefly, is that, you know, on face value, it would be easy to look at some of Charles's work with the Prince's Trust and him saying, like, I can identify with all of you who are disadvantaged because, you know, I have a hard life. But the way he's always phrased it, and I did some Googling after this, is essentially like, what I have learned in the life that, my difficulties, is that no one truly knows anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very true. And if there was ever going to be a thing that he could take from his life that could animate charity work, it is that thought. It is the thought that that you never know someone's full story. Now, do I think he probably blames some of those kids, or he's super judgy about crack babies, or like, yes, I'm sure he's like, I'm not looking at, like, you know, social worker, His Royal Majesty Prince Charles here, but we have consistently seen throughout his work, and not just with the Prince's Trust, because he's like super environmentalist and has been
for decades.
And he was very vocal in some of the Good Friday Agreement stuff too, as much as any of them were vocal in the Good Friday Agreement, that, like, which they couldn't be, but, you know, there was some talk, and it was always, you never know someone's whole story. And that, I think, was the thing that he took from his marriage, is that no one really knows us. And if you have to take one thing from that, it's not a bad thing to take. And so, yes, please don't, just for your eyes, Google the rap battle dance thing that he did at the end, because that's a real story. But he's earnest in that.
Yeah.
And I think, we've mentioned this, I know, before, but, like, we know people who have met them. And none of the kind of a phrase that they use for Charles and Camilla is warm. Mm-hmm. And, like, when you're in the room with them, they seem to care about who's really in front of them. And that's a skill, even if it's a lie. So I think, you know.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I think it can seem disingenuous, that scene where he's standing in front of the after-school program that he's helped raise money for. But I think, you know, he didn't go so far as to say, like, I know exactly how you feel. He just said, I know what it's like to be judged and for people not to know me.
Yeah.
And I
Perfect phrasing.
I think that means that he can connect with people, especially, you know, low-income, disadvantaged, oppressed people groups. And we see that with his... with the part of his Dimbley interview where he talks specifically about wanting to represent all the faiths of modern Britain. Mm-hmm. I think he was earnest in that.
100%.
I think he is a curious person who wanted to know about the world and recognized change and wanted the institution to change. And those
he just unfortunately couldn't do that in his first wife.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what we love about this show is the deep character studies of making very public people that we have very specific understandings of very complicated. Yeah. And muddying those waters. And so very much this kind of evolution of Charles is fascinating to me and what I am here for, and I hope they continue what they did in episodes 4 and 5 throughout the rest of the episodes, or continue to reference it at least. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, if they will or not. Sometimes they love to drop threads on this show, oh so very much. But I think we're probably due for a couple Diana episodes now, as she has been noticeably absent for a couple episodes. So I think the tennis battle will continue, and the ball will go back to Diana's side, and we'll see what they come up with. But yeah, if you watched our first 3 episodes and then you watch these 2, you're going to be like, wow, happened to the good doctors. We watched good television.
Yeah, we're not always cranks.
We're not nonstop criticism machines.
Yeah, we're not Statler and Waldorf over here. Like, we do actually enjoy things.
So that is, I'm sure, as refreshing for you guys to hear as it is for us to be in that position. And so long may it continue with this show. But we will see you all next for episode 6 here on the YouTube. If you want to join us on the Patreon, whether you are a patron or would like to become one, the link is in the downstairs. You can head on over and catch our Monarch moment for this episode, which again, we'll be looking at this idea of defender of the faith versus defender of faith and what that could possibly mean for Charles's reign as King Charles III. And if you join the Patreon now, you can catch up on all our Monarch moments. And you can watch our Mania moments if you watch The Handmaid's Tale. And you can get extra coverage of holiday movies. And if you want to pay a little bit extra, you can get early access without YouTube ads. We give and we give and we give. And it's all on the Patreon. So head over there after this. And the only thing I did not like about this episode, aside from, as we discussed, the lack of honesty about the press, was being forced to see Dominic West, who has so much rhythm, so much gravitas and charm, attempt to dance as if he were Prince Charles to hip-hop music. I did not need to see that. I felt like I needed to wash my eyeballs afterwards. Charles never had that kind of rhythm, and so I was just like, yeah, it was not a pleasant way for me to end the episode. I'm sure people will find it charming, but I was like, what can seen cannot be unseen. And was staring at my notes in all caps that now I have to go wash my eyeballs. I hope you didn't have to wash your eyeballs after this episode, and certainly after our conversation, and we will see you guys soon.